Yeah, my name's Sonja Elwood. I'd like to start just with a little acknowledgement of country. I'm presenting at the moment from Guringai land, and I know you're all across Sydney out there, and I know a couple of people even from the South Coast might be signing in, so you may wish to acknowledge country from where you're sitting and tuning in. And I'd also like to acknowledge it on behalf of all of Sydney Wildlife and across the Greater Sydney Basin that we operate in. So acknowledging and respecting the traditional owners of the lands that we're from, past, present and emerging in the future. So a little bit about me. I'm an ecologist by day and work in local government. But a lot of my time for the last 35 years, I've been a licensed wildlife carer. And in 1997, I founded Sydney Wildlife with about 300 other licensed carers. And we've been operating, so now what, nearly 23, 4 years. We rescue between 12 and 15,000 animals a year across the greater metropolitan Sydney area. We also do several thousand inquiry calls per year. And we also undertake about 150, 200, sometimes more educational events every year, whether that be something like this. These new online ones are different, but that's okay. But we also, we do children's groups, we do schools, we do green days, we do community events, we do fairs. So all of that sort of thing as well. So we've got a whole band of people that actually do education as well. I'll just, that work? I'm just gonna, okay, that should work. I can't seem to page down. Is that because the polling's there?
I'm not sure, it might be.
There
oh, there you go.
Right.
Good.
Hitting the wrong button. Okay, so Sydney Wildlife is just one rescue group in New South Wales. There are actually 27 groups across the state, and 26 of us are part of what's called the New South Wales Wildlife Council. So the Wildlife Council is the peak body for wildlife rehabilitation in the state. Can you not do that, please? Yeah, so the New South Wales Wildlife Council is the peak body for rehab in the state, and all of our groups have representatives on the council. So we get together every 3 months, look at issues, emerging issues and whatever's going on in our different regional areas. We work hand in hand with the Department of Planning, Infrastructure and Environment. And we put together with them a lot of the codes of practice, a very new wildlife rehab framework that will be coming out shortly, and that sort of thing. And certainly this talk this evening will be predominantly about, well, the first part of it will be about the last summer, the Black Summer fires, and what happened to our network and sort of the activities that we got up to trying to assist wildlife. And then the last part of the presentation will be a little bit about the Parramatta area and that part of your neck of the woods. So what's happening with wildlife in that area. If you'd like to ask questions, I do encourage it. So please pop them in the chat or, yeah, and I will get back to you later. Oh, and the polls come up again. Okay, so the New South Wales Wildlife Council, you know, the fires for us started really in August of last year. And August, September and early October, they were actually in the north of New South Wales. Unfortunately, those fires were contained, although they were quite extensive and horribly, they devastated some of the rainforest areas. So those areas have never really burnt. They're not supposed to burn. So that was a really awful event up there. And obviously, as they were going out, the South Coast started up and so did the Blue Mountains. Up in the north, our carers immediately started sort of feeding and watering programs and getting out water stations, and that program actually extended right across the state. So my role with Sydney Wildlife also means that I'm a representative on the Wildlife Council. And I initially was terrified that it was going to come to Sydney, and I was really concerned about our carers, particularly those that live near bushland, and really worried that they didn't have an evacuation plan, really worried that for those that had a lot of animals in care, would they be able to get out quickly? Had they planned for that? So I spent a lot of sort of October, November and into early December trying to arrange, make sure that our members were thinking about that sort of thing, but also organising evacuation centres. And I rapidly realised that we really didn't have anywhere to go. I contacted a lot of the local councils, and because we're not part of the DPI sort of emergency response framework, I couldn't really get anyone to help us. And funnily enough, it was the New South Wales Scouts that came to our rescue. They own most of their properties, and I contacted them, and within 48 hours, I had 15 evacuation points and properties made available to us that included showers and kitchens and yards and fenced areas. And so we were really, Sydney Wildlife was really helped out with that. So the fires didn't come to Sydney, and my role on the New South Wales Wildlife Council, apart from representing Sydney Wildlife, I'm actually their media officer. So I run a lot of this social platforms for them. And I just found that as the fires escalated and spread, and the whole world sort of cottoned on to what was happening here, the traffic on our pages was just getting enormous. I was coming home from work, and literally, come the end of November, December, I was up till 2, 3 in the morning just trying to respond to hundreds of concerned sort of messages and disaster response groups from all over the world. And of course, people wanting to donate and wanting to help us. At the end of December, when everyone else was sort of shutting down for Christmas, I sort of called the State Department and I said, look, I'm really, really fearful as to what's happening with these fires. And at that point, something like 70% of our entire network was in a fire zone. And we were getting to that point sort of around Christmas where people were being evacuated right across the south coast in certain areas, Malakuta and Bermagui, all of those sorts of areas. And come New Year's Eve, sadly, we nearly lost 2 wildlife carers. And unfortunately, again, the answer was, well, you're sort of on your own. So as of New Year's Eve, once we sort of, nearly lost 2 wildlife carers, Sydney Wildlife decided that we really needed to do something. I, of course, sitting in the safety of Sydney and being represented by and representing the council and having contact with all of these groups from overseas, I actually accepted their invite to come and help us. And as fortune would have it, the last week in December also meant that Sydney Wildlife's a 3-year project came to fruition, and that was the establishment of a mobile veterinary unit. We never dreamt that it would be immediately deployed into the fire grounds, but as you can see from this photo, that's a week after we got it, and off we went down to the south coast. So we were very fortunate we were fully staffed by vets from Sydney, very experienced wildlife vets who volunteered their time to help us. They brought in locums to run their practices in Sydney, and they jumped on board and headed south with us. That's our little send-off from the Northern Beaches. We have a facility, a wildlife facility up at what used to be Waratah Park. And so that was the little send-off from the Northern Beaches branch from there. That was sort of, a very happy moment, and we were very excited at that point. And we knew we were going to something that was really big. but actually getting down into the fire grounds was an extremely sobering experience for all of us. So our first stop was actually at Wandandian, which is about 30 minutes south of Nowra. And the first group to arrive 24 hours after us was a Kiwi group called Hoo Ha, which is Helping You Help Animals New Zealand. They are an animal disaster response. Primarily, they look after domestic animals. I'm a Kiwi myself, and this lady had contacted me every second day for weeks. And in the end, I said, look, I'm going to have to ring you because I'm happy for you to come over, but I don't have a plan, and we don't have a plan. But we do have a property that we've been offered by a carer that used to be with Sydney Wildlife, who is now on the South Coast. We're just going to go down and see what we can do. And so off we went. And 24 hours later, this crew arrived under Carolyn Press Mackenzie to help. And they brought with them builders, vets, a cook. They hired all their own gear. They hired camper vans and what have you that they could actually live in. And they stayed until New Zealand shut its borders with COVID. So they stayed with us till third or fourth week in March. The other group that flew in the following day was the Animal Disaster Response Team from Germany. And they brought an enormous amount of technology with them, which was absolutely so helpful. They brought drones with heat sensing technology, which meant even when we couldn't do search and rescue at night, we could actually send a drone out, and the drone could go over vast areas that we couldn't cover, looking for heat signatures of animals that and locating where they might be and where they might be in distress. So they were incredible. They, apart from doing search and rescue with us and bringing animals to us, they also played an enormous role in setting up the water stations and feeding programs, which I must say the entire southern community also engaged in. The response from the community, who are already so devastated, was really quite amazing. And the third group that arrived same day, so everyone arrived at the same time, fortuitously, was the search and rescue crew from Canada. That's only about half of them there. The other half are out doing something. But again, they brought a remarkable technology with them, the same as the Germans. They were already prepared with drones and all sorts of technology to detect animals. They also, as you can see there, they've been out that day. They were installing water stations, not just on the property that we were staying on, but various properties that we were rescuing from. I did a press release when I was down there, which was picked up very quickly by the local paper and the local sort of publications and the local radio. And the minute that the local community heard what we were trying to do, the calls started coming, and we started getting, being able to get out there and finding out where these animals were and where they were emerging from into properties that obviously still had some water and still had a little bit of habitat left. Aussie Mobile Vets then also joined us. That's the photo on the right there. And they were a remarkable pair of twins who are vets. And again, they're still working out there now. So they're managing their local practices, but spending weekends down on the South Coast, still rehabilitating animals and treating animals. So this is just a little taste. I don't know if any of you have been down to the South Coast or even out to the Blue Mountains just to see what's happened. It's really worth doing. I know it's sobering. I know perhaps it's not something you want to see, but to really understand the scale and the extent of the loss and the intensity of these fires. The main road you can see on the left there is the Princess Highway, and there's a road right across the screen, which is the road to Tomarong. So we're just near Wandandian there, which is our first triage centre. But this landscape, this intensely burnt landscape, went on for hundreds of kilometres. And And in fact, goes right down to the border with Victoria and right across into Victoria and Gippsland. It's an enormous area. Some parts of it are not too bad, but the bulk of it is really intensely burnt. Many of the trees in the forest, even as you can see in this photo, the soils were burnt. So you would walk sort of, into these devastated areas and you would crunch underfoot. The soil was so burnt, it was fried. And trees, it looks like the fires are out, but individual trees, the larger ones, actually were still burning. So they burnt for weeks. They were sort of roasting on the inside. There's a photo of one there. So it was really quite devastating. Sadly, we were never allowed into public lands. So we very much relied on members of the public to let us into their lands. And people were very willing to do so. They really wanted to help surviving wildlife. So just the overall scope, I know it's quite depressing, but again, as I say, the scope of this is really something that I think, we all need to be aware of. And we all need to work to, save what wildlife we have left. We're very lucky in Sydney. I used to grizzle, and have for years that, about the losses in Sydney, but I used to console myself with the fact that, the forests are out there. Well, the forests aren't actually out there anymore, and our wildlife's not out there anymore. And urbanised wildlife and areas that haven't been fire devastated are where the pools of recruitment are going to come from for some of these animals if we're going to get them back into really wild places one day. So we really need to protect our urban spaces as well and our urban bushland. So this is the first triage area. It's a big barn shed in Wandandian. It's still running today. We were joined there by many members of Wildlife Rescue South Coast. They were many of them devastated. Some of them had even lost their homes. Most of them had lost their wildlife infrastructure. So even though they were rescuing the macropod runs, the wombat enclosures, the reptile pits, the aviaries, everything on their land had been devastated along with their bushland. And here they were, still trying to help wildlife. So this was the beginning. So day one, fortunately, we realised straight away, all of this infrastructure is missing. So Hoo-Ha in New Zealand had brought builders with them who immediately started building and setting up macropod runs, temporary ones, enclosure areas, temporary ones. And you'll see various styles as I go through this presentation, depending on where the triage area was that we set up. This was actually quite flash. We had power, running water, we had a whole barn, we had shelter, and then the builders, there's the Hoo-Ha team. We all look quite relaxed and happy. We're exhausted and probably slightly dazed, but they're an amazing team. And they kept flying people in. So you could only really do 1 or 2 weeks at a time. It was too intense. So they'd fly people out and replace them. And they had a crew of about 12 for 3 months rotating through. They also brought vets with them and vet nurses, and they brought a cook, as I said, so we were always fed. So they were very much prepared for this sort of disaster, which is something we've never faced before. So the second thing we realised, apart from the fact we needed builders, was that we needed shooters and darters, and that's something actually that the wildlife rehab sector don't really have. So I rang the New South Wales Gun and Safety Council and explained my situation to them, and they very rapidly responded, thank goodness. And within 24 hours, I had about 20 volunteer shooters and darters. This shooter actually that you're seeing there, the red spot on the animal is a dart. So it's an anesthetic dart, because a lot of these animals were semi-mobile, and if you know what kangaroos are like, you're never going to chase one down. Some of them, and we found as well, a lot of them were mums with joeys at foot, and we really didn't want to separate mums and joeys, so we needed to sedate both of them to bring them in, and bring them into safety and get them treatment. So often the mums had put baby in the pouch, but she was burnt. So we needed both of them to come in. Again, a lot of these people did all of this for nothing. We have no money in the New South Wales Wildlife Network, not a lot. We're entirely voluntary, all the groups. We've got no paid staff, and we rely on public donation. So we really had no money. And all of these people did all of this for us for nothing. It was really incredible. Another photo of our shooters and darters. So again, these are darting guns. So it's a very high level of licensing, and you're not allowed to operate these without vets. And I'm getting to the vets in a moment. So the vets prescribe the drugs and set things up for the shooter, and actually administer the drug into the dart for the animal that they're looking at. So they calculate it based on, estimating size and weight of an animal, whether it's a wombat or a kangaroo, a macropod, some sort of kangaroo, wallaby. So there are a couple of graphic photos. I just warn people, but don't be alarmed. Most of these photos are part of the treatment. So the animals are actually being helped, and even though it looks terrible, they're all sedated, they're all under pain relief, and they were all under medical care. But this is a typical injury. No matter what animal came in, always the feet were burnt. And you can't actually leave those feet sealed like that. They're almost sort of cauterized. We needed to debride them. And that was sort of the job, really, day in, day out. So that's a debrided foot. And that's actually getting it down to healthy tissue. And we couldn't let that seal over. We need the tissue to regrow from the bottom out. So that meant bandage changes every day, pain relief every day, managing pain and managing shock. And certainly for the bigger animals and the big alpha males, it was actually better anyway to keep them sedated, because they were the ones most likely to panic. Although I must say the animals seemed to cotton on really quickly that we were actually there to help them. So this is a little Irish vet. She came with Hoo-Ha New Zealand, and she's actually just monitoring this animal coming out of sedation, having had all its bandages changed. So this was a lot of our work. It didn't matter what species it was, but bandaging, flamazine ointment for burns, and then monitoring and pain management, making sure they got enough food. If they were joeys, of course, making sure they were getting enough milk as well. There's a big girl in care, again, similar injuries. So macropods, I don't know if you're aware, but macropods are very clever in fires. They've evolved with fires for a long time. Nothing like they saw obviously in this horrible summer, but they will, if they're backed up into a valley or something like that, they will face the fire front and they will race through it, because they know if they can get through to the other side of the fire front, they will get to land where the fire has abated or is abating. The ground will still be hot and their little feet get scorched, but they can get to safety by getting to the other side of the fire. And that's how we got this, probably a lot of our survivors, I think. And the fact that these animals were living close enough to human habitation, so they were spilling out into areas looking for water. So there's temporary enclosure you can see in the background, built by Hoo-Ha, and this is for the day patients. So patients that we've already treated in the barn, they've been deemed well enough to go into the yards, the temporary yards that we set up. You can see right through the fence there's a whole heap of water stations that have been built, that are being distributed. But this was the day, and it went on 20 hours a day, changing bandages. All the animals had their own charts, just like in the hospital. And the local wildlife group, all the wildlife carers came up and helped us with this routine, maintaining this routine. And then there were orphans, so lots of orphans. So the little one in my hands there on the right, obviously at that age, they need to be bottle fed. But we found we had so many joeys at what we call at foot. So they're at a stage where they're either emerging from the pouch for short periods of time, or they are at foot all the time with their mum. And so the builders made this clever design to so that they could feed themselves, and we could feed a lot of them all at once. We just we couldn't keep up doing it by hand. So myopathy trauma, post-traumatic trauma, same for the animals, just as it's like for people. So, and a lot of companionship. So the photo on the right, that's Flash and Flame and Ash. Ash is actually holding Flame there. So she'd been in a few days, they'd been coming together. They didn't have their mums, lots of orphans. But they bonded very quickly with one another. And that day she actually crashed. And I honestly think it was him that got her through. So lots of animals looking after animals as well. So veterinary assistants, Vets Beyond Borders were absolutely amazing. Again, they worked right through to the end of COVID, or to, you know, April, May of COVID. Fortunately, vets were declared an essential service. So even when we went into lockdown in March, we were able to keep some of our triage areas running. And bless Vets Beyond Borders and Vets with Compassion, who just kept rostering vets for us. Vets kept volunteering their time, putting up their hands and heading out. We were joined by Macquarie University staff, veterinary staff. They have a big wildlife park out at Macquarie Uni. We're very grateful to them and for their assistance. And they actually, Dr. Clark took over the rostering at Wandandyan, and that freed us up to move further south. So we could actually go and start setting up further triage areas. Wollongong University also climbed on board, and so did Charles Sturt University. So that all of their veterinary experts and wildlife experts came down to give us a hand. So typical sort of surgery examination, it's all very makeshift, but it worked. And that's a little Eastern Grey being examined, having bandages put on. So much of the work sometimes had to be done in the field, or the start of it, just to get animals stabilised and moved. So after about 5 days, Sydney Wildlife's van moved on, and because we had the support of Hoo-Ha, Vets Beyond Borders and Vets with Compassion, we were able to send our mobile unit out to the Blue Mountains. And we know that the wildlife group out there was very, they only have a handful of members and they were in big trouble. Blue Mountains was still burning. So when we went out there, we found that Dr. Howard Ralph of Southern Cross Wildlife Care, which is a charity in its own right, that all they do is veterinary care for wildlife, just an incredible organisation. And he was already out there with his team. So we were able to join them and help them. The Army have a base out there, and when they heard what we were trying to do, they were on board as well, and a lot of those guys started bringing us animals as well. Once again, we were a bit more savvy this time. We rostered shooters and darters, and that operation ran for about 6 weeks or so. The Blue Mountains fires were absolutely intense. The geography of the land was such that the fires, I mean, they were ferocious in parts on the south coast, but they were really ferocious in parts, really ferocious in the Blue Mountains. And even today, parts of the Blue Mountains are just not regenerating like we would normally see after a fire. As I said, Vets for Compassion joined us out there, and also joined us on the south coast later, and again worked right through COVID and lockdown, manning these triage centres. We found that the animals very much tried to maintain their own routine. So a lot of them were nocturnal. So lots of movement with macropods at dawn or really early in the morning and in the evening. And so we actually tried to set up a program with our shooters and darters with vets to get out there at those times when the animals were on the move and we could detect them, and we could send drones up to find where they were. If you can imagine what that meant for the vets, though, they'd spend dawn out there loading up dart guns with our shooters and darters. They spent all day managing the animals, and then they went out in the evening and did this again, and then they came back and managed more animals. So they were working 16, 20, 22 hours a day, grabbing sleep when they could. So I just can't thank them enough. More little people from the Blue Mountains. Sadly, a lot of the ground animals, we didn't get a lot. We got a handful of snakes, no ground mammals, unfortunately, but we did get wombats who managed to obviously hide in their burrows. And obviously a lot of animals, you couldn't outrun these fires. There was nowhere to go. So they were really intense. Of course, for the bigger animals, you can't lift them on your own. So if you're faced with a 60-kilo macropod, you need two people, you need it sedated, and you need a stretcher. So, yeah, all sorts of sort of makeshift things we had to sort of get together to make everything operational. But just an incredible effort by so many. You know, necessity really is the mother of invention. Once again, little triage areas set up wherever we could and operating tables, just trying to save whatever we could. Oh, and then the rains came. So that would have been the first couple of weeks of February, and that brought its own problems. So when you're out there in the rain trying to get hold of animals, it's just that little bit more miserable. But nevertheless, we created lots of shelters, and we started building shelters with covers as well, so the animals weren't getting too drenched when they were attending feed stations. And we found feed stations were a great way to get injured animals because they'd come for the easy food and there was no food out there. And then we could sort of, from a distance, we could sedate them and get our hands on them and get them the help they needed. So we were going to set up our third triage area at Two Thumbs Wildlife Trust, which is run by James Fitzgerald, and he's in the group Wildcare Queanbeyan, so moving a bit further south now from Wandandian. And it was very lucky we didn't go the day that we were scheduled there, because that was unfortunately and sadly the day that the water tanker came down and the two American firefighters lost their lives. So that was exactly where we were going to set up our triage hospital to help James, because close by at Nerriga, another hospital had gone down. He had just 2 days before that gone and got all of their koalas out, and he had put them in his sanctuary in his hospital, and he lost everything when that tanker went down. It burnt the hospital down, and sadly we lost the firefighters, and sadly we lost all the animals that he'd rescued from the surrounding region. We actually went that day and for a couple of days to Bendalong, and we left a building crew there, and that was to the property where the wildlife carers had nearly lost their lives. So that was in the area of Native Animal Rescue Group, which covers the Braidwood sort of region. And their property, would you believe, looters had been through, we had heard. So not only were they in hospital and fighting for their lives, but someone had ransacked their house. So the hoo-ha builders went up there, totally secured the property, put up security fencing, and then we sent a crew of ladies in to clean up the house and the builders to start fixing and securing their home. So for the day, in the hope that the day they would get out of hospital, everything would at least be operational. So the third area, rather than going that close to the fire grounds, we went to Cooma, and the caravan park there offered us a big sort of family hall type thing and grounds. And again, Hoo-Ha New Zealand went to work building enclosures, and Vets Beyond Borders came with us, and Vets with Compassion. And in this region, we were helping sister groups, Snowy Mountains Wildlife Rescue, or LAOCO, looking after our Kosciuszko orphans, and Wildcare Queanbeyan. So 3 regional groups sort of around that area we were able to assist. Very similar process, so setting up triage areas. Again, everything looks pretty makeshift, but it really worked. And again, Hoo-Ha working their magic, setting up temporary enclosures so we could house these animals and accommodate them all. And we were there in koala territory, so we started actively looking for koalas as well. We then kept following the fires. So all of these triage areas, as we left them manned, and the local wildlife carers took on the day-to-day running and the general work, and Vets Beyond Borders and Vets with Compassion continued their rosters, staffing them. So our 4th triage area, we went further south again, and that was a call I received from a guy, a wildlife carer in a very remote area, and in the Snowy Mountains, and very close to the Melbourne border. And he was completely burnt out. His house was gone. The property was devastated. He had no power. He had no phone. So it was a really big challenge, but he had a number of animals and he was desperately trying to save them on his own. So again, this is what Hoo-Ha built when they were down there. They had to start from scratch. So the nearest hardware store was 2 hours away. And this is what they built. So plastic, sort of A-framed home, mini hospital wards. And again, we had no power and all of that sort of thing, but it worked. And then the rains came again. So, of course, we were out there in the rain trying to get the animals in our little plastic shelters, but we were able to get quite a lot of animals out of that, and he was surrounded by national park. So it was really heartening, to be able to get as many animals out of there as we did. Unfortunately, with the rains, just like us, and smoke inhalation, we started seeing some viruses and respiratory diseases as well. So it wasn't just burns and infections related to burns, it was more disease related. So typical feet of a burned animal, and all of that, of course, needs debriding and antibiotic treatment, both on the wounds and internally. There's our little operating tables. The routine of bandaging and debriding, again, pain management, shock management. And yeah, I really can't sing the praises of Hoo-Ha New Zealand, Vets Beyond Borders, Vets with Compassion enough. We'd have been lost without them, and the shooters and the darters that spent weeks following us around. With no power on the property, we had to work with torches and headlamps at night, and with so many patients, we did find cars were useful. And also the handles on the cars, the handholds were pretty useful for hanging drips and that sort of IV lines and that sort of thing as well. So our final triage area was in Breadbow, and the caravan park obviously at Cooma couldn't be permanent. So we managed to find a farmer who gave us these lands and these couple of barns, and again, Hoo-Ha New Zealand and the builders started setting up enclosures. So this is a permanent facility now, and it's still operating today, and it's servicing LAOCO and the group Sonar that straddles both New South Wales and Victoria, and some from Wildcare Queanbeyan. So sadly, a lot of smoke inhalation and related diseases. Birds, although they could fly away, the smoke inhalation seemed to come later, or related illnesses with that. So we didn't get a lot of birds from the fires. But after the event, we started seeing sort of birds coming in and reptiles emerging. And of course, the other thing that happened during the fires that was sort of swept, didn't get any highlights, was our flying foxes. So they had a terrible starvation event in August, September, and a terrible pup abandonment event that we've never seen before in October, November, and then, of course, followed by heat stress events in January and February. So those specialised carers and those specialised facilities were absolutely worked off their feet for 6 months as well. And yeah, I take my hat off to them as well. And post-fire, so come March and lockdown through this program a little bit, but Sydney Wildlife have been, and I've been organising rebuild weekends for wildlife carers on the coast, trying to re-establish some of that infrastructure for wildlife caring that's been lost. So sadly, it's not covered by insurance because they're not considered permanent structures. So a lot of people needed help getting these facilities back up and running so they could get back to doing, wildlife care. We've had great sponsors through Rescue Recovery Resources, a Canadian group, and also from I4, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and the Humane Society International. So I've been taking groups of volunteers down, and we're rebuilding wombat enclosures, rebuilding macropod enclosures, spending time with people down there and carers down there, which is also a little bit part of their therapy. It's really nice when you've been through such a terrible experience and you've lost so much, knowing that people know what you're going through and are willing to help. So I'd invite any of you that are interested in that sort of thing, or anything that Sydney Wildlife get up to, you're more than welcome to give us a hand or come down for a weekend. So I'll give you some details later on how to get in touch. And I realise I'm running a little bit over time, so let me get on to Parramatta. So that was our adventures in the fire. But I took the liberty of having a look at some of our wildlife records, and Parramatta is a pretty urbanised area. But so the dominant dominant numbers were brush-tail and ring-tail possums, diamond pythons, blue-tongue lizards, so things you do kind of expect in your backyard. A few venomous snakes out there, some red-bellied black snakes and that sort of thing. And a lot of, I must say, of urban adapted birds. So magpies, lorikeets, noisy miners, ibis, sulphur-crested cockatoos. And sadly, I'd have to say in Sydney, those numbers are probably way out of proportion, simply because they've coped so well with the urban environment. They're potentially, at the numbers they're at in some areas, they're probably displacing possibly some of them, the sort of minority birds, unfortunately. And of course, Parramatta has a colony of flying foxes out there. So flying foxes appear also in our records quite strongly with heat stress events and baby rescues in particular in spring. So then I went further because I was curious about what threatened species you might have in Parramatta. And, there's a little poll coming up for you. I've probably given it away because I've put the slide up, rats. We'd love to know what animals that you've seen, whether it be in your backyard or, and have you ever had to help an injured animal? Did you know who to go to, or did you struggle to find help? Did you know about Sydney Wildlife? Good, you're all answering, very good. So BioNet is the State Department's fauna recording system. Now it records records right across the state. It's largely used by government land managers, local councils, national parks, but also researchers and scientists, conservationists, ecologists. And it's also used by developers because they need to do environmental assessments on their lands before they develop. And they need to access this in particular to find out if there are threatened species present in areas they want to develop. So for the very first time last year, the State Department uploaded 15 years worth of wildlife rescue data, and that contributed hundreds of thousands of records to the database, and tens of thousands of records to some of the local government areas, so including Parramatta. So you've got 59 threatened species in your area, which is really quite significant, I would have to say. I know in Pittwater, where I live, we've got 68, 69, and we're one of the most biodiverse areas left in Sydney. So 59 is really great. That does include camber, roe camber and jamba species. Now, they're the migratory species. So the Japanese Australia Migratory Birds Agreement, Korea and Russia agreements with them, and Siberia. And yeah, so those species. And I must say, I'm going to go into some of your records now. Cursor in the right place. And I was really quite staggered at how many of these birds you actually see in Parramatta. So just having a look at some of these records, the red I highlighted because if any of you are interested in seeking threatened species, anything I've sort of highlighted in red, all of them are worth pursuing, but that little red crowned toadlet was sighted in 2005. And it'd be really lovely to know if red crowned toadlets are still in Parramatta somewhere. So that's a record worth digging out and digging out the location. I've got all the records if you want them. And going and having a little survey or contacting the Frog and Tadpole Study Group and seeing if they would like to come out and help you do a citizen science survey. You've got your usual great big flyover birds or big birds, so the white-bellied sea eagle, eastern osprey, and that when we get a bit further down, you'll see the powerful owls, the barking owls. But it's interesting to see the years that some of these animals were discovered in your area. The records seem to be fairly consistent in terms of recording. So it's was hard for me to tell what the survey effort is because your Parramatta seems to provide good records to Bionet. But a lot of your animals were very much, as I said earlier, related to these migratory birds and water. So that's obviously the river. So things like your black bitters and your Australasian bitters are looking for fresh water or briny water. But things like the curlew sandpiper and all the sandpipers there, pectoral sandpiper, marsh sandpiper, sharp-tailed sandpiper, broad-billed sandpiper, that's remarkable. Well, I felt that was remarkable. If I jump down the page, I've got the cursor in the wrong spot again. So again, the curlews, the snipes, stints, and that sort of thing. Again, these birds are really significant, and obviously they are using parts of maybe around Homebush, and certainly that Parramatta River area. And the Pacific golden plover, amazing. But you would never expect that, or I would never have expected that in Parramatta. So if any of you are bird watchers out there, or twitchers, or even amateur, just like going out, really worth trying to find, see if you can find some of these species and making sure these records get in. I'm quite happy to give you a copy of these and the records that I sort of went through. I put these tables together, but you could easily, from the tables I've created, drill down into where these animals are and go and do your own little surveys. So the red ones, again, the dusky wood swallow. So a threatened species that seemed to be prevalent 2000, 2001, 2002, up to 2003, then disappeared, but sighted again in 2017. Another bird worthy to go and see where that little guy is hanging on, and maybe enhancing that habitat or working out what habitat he's in. Again, 2003, we started seeing the owls coming in 2010. So calicivirus, we know, out in the plains beyond sort of the Blue Mountains really impacted the rabbit population, and there was scientific speculation that some of those bigger raptors started moving into the city, looking for pickings, better pickings. So interesting, your owl records as well. But the owl's not so often thought of, the barking owl, the sooty owl, incredible that you have them in your area. And the spotted tail quoll, wow. I mean, 3 sightings of that guy, also remarkable and worthy of someone following up. And then, of course, you've got loads of little microbats. And I do think the microbats, they appear in the records at around the mid-2000s, but I think that's really when the technology for detecting them really started ramping up, and there was a real interest generated in the scientific community. So I suspect you always had those microbats around, and you may well have more. So again, the anabat detectors now are much, much easier for scientists and researchers to use. And even council, if you ask council to go and get a song meter, they only cost about $300. You can literally plug it into your iPhone or plug it into an iPad, and you can stand and look at these recordings of these calls that we can't hear, and you can identify them sort of real time on the spot. So all sorts of little things you can do in there. And then as of 2014, this little swag of birds that, so I wonder who's been birding around you, or are we seeing a movement of birds, or some of them really significant? You know, the regent honeyeater, highly critically endangered. The swift parrot, similarly. So the grass owl, also a very cryptic bird. So some really exciting little birds there. And then you've got the little migratory birds like the scarlet robin and the flame robin. Well, they migrate in winter right across Sydney, and they even pop up in the northern beaches. They come down from the Blue Mountains. They're only this size, so how they manage to do that, I've got no idea. But obviously they've been picked up around your LGA as well, out in Parramatta. So, and then the Dural land snail, so another one really, you know, some really, really interesting stuff. I'm really pushing it for time. So ways you can help. I'm not going to go over this very much. I think a lot of you know this, but planting natives. Water. I can't stress this enough. Honestly, we've been in drought for about 4 years. It's been serious, and it's been serious in the urban areas as well. Please put water out in your yard. Please ask council. We're starting a program in the Northern Beaches where in some of our reserves, we're going to start looking at how we can put water out in safely in areas for our wildlife for really hot days, and just generally, and get cameras over them and send your sightings in and get excited about it, because you'll be amazed at what will come. This is my backyard, and it's actually a mini pond I didn't even finish last summer because I ran off to the fires. But this is just the base of a wheelbarrow, and I thought, oh, I could make a little mini pond out of that. And I started it and filled it, and now the daisies and all sorts have grown over it. But I'm starting to have visitors, and I'm also getting possums at night coming to visit. Nest boxes, artificial drays for all sorts of animals are vital. I'm sure a lot of you know it takes up to and over 100 years for natural hollows to form. For some of those bigger animals, they're critical for breeding, the powerful owls, the glossy black cockatoos, the parrots, all of those little guys, and of course all of the brush-tailed possums and that sort of thing, they all need them as well. So creating drays and creating that habitat for them, and letting people know of your success stories as well. If you manage to get an animal in there, recording them and bionet, all really important. And number 4, please don't use rat poisons. We've got what's called the second generation of rodenticides on our supermarket shelves. They are highly toxic substances. If you talk to a chemist about what's actually in those, and I have done, and we've actually had a speaker come to Sydney Wildlife about it, and we do see the animals, the secondary poisoning. but they're highly toxic to us as well, and they bioaccumulate. They're absolutely hideous. There is, I noticed, a petition going around at the moment that's being sent to government to actually get them more heavily regulated, because, you know, they're up there with pindone and 1080 and all of that sort of thing. They're really terrible. So please try avoid using those sorts of poisons in your yard, whether it be for slugs or you know, mice and that sort of thing. Try and find an alternative. They affect reptiles, and they affect your raptors and your nightjars, so your tawny frogmouth. Keeping pets in at night, keeping pets out of bushland. Don't just let you know, dogs and cats roam. We need to really learn how to share our environment with all the animals. And as I said earlier, Sydney is now a reservoir of many species in little pocket areas where we don't get them in our forests anymore, and we may not see them again in our forests, or not for a very long time. So really, these urban spaces are becoming really important for sustaining wildlife and the remaining wildlife. Please report pest species to council. So foxes in particular, they're all over Sydney. I do, you know, some of the control for Northern Beaches Council, who I worked for, and you would be amazed at how many are around. But let your council know, because we can't act if we don't know the animals there. I'm always grateful when a member of the public calls me or emails me and tells me that they've got a fox active, you know, in their area. Worm farms, minimising waste, minimising plastics. I'm sure you've heard all of that, all the sustainability talk before, but it's all relevant. Establishing a beehive. Now, native beehives are a delight, and they also make pretty yummy honey. It's very sour. I don't know if you've ever tried native honey, but it's beautiful. Most of our Aussie bees are stingless. You know, there's 300 odd species that won't sting you, and they're tiny and they're delightful. There's only a couple of species that we can look after in Sydney, the sugar bags, because we're at the southern limit of their range temperature-wise. You go sort of beyond Sydney and you get down into beyond Nowra, and it's just too cold. But yeah, very worthwhile to have around. And unlike the bigger bees, they're able to get into some of our native plants that the bigger bees can't pollinate. So we need those little guys out there as well. Report all your wildlife sightings to council or directly. You can log into Bionet and create yourself a login, and you can do it yourself and contribute to your local area's records. Make it hard for those developers to just put, you know, if those developers don't find records out there in your area, they don't have to assess. So make sure you put those wildlife sightings in, or let council know, and they'll put them into their database and make sure they're uploaded into Bionet. There's a whole swag of apps that you can do IDs with, and that you can also log sightings with, that will also get loaded up into Bionet. So there's a few there I've listed: frog IDs, butterflies, turtles, freshwater turtles and other turtles, koalas, not that we sadly get a lot of them in Sydney, although we do in southwestern Sydney. Brush turkeys. I know there's research going on about the sulphur-crested cockatoo population that's absolutely booming in Sydney. But there's lots of activities, just as sitting in your own backyard or in your own local bushland, that you can really make a contribution to. This week, by the way, a little plug, BirdLife Australia are running the National Backyard National Backyard Birds. So jump onto their website and register, and just between now and Sunday, record some of the birds in your local area. Let them know where they are. In terms of injured animals, of course, the I4, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, their app covers the entire state. So it's really handy to have that on your phone. It will tell you, you know, if you come across an animal in the middle of nowhere that's maybe been hit by a car or something like that, it will locate where you are, it will GPS you, and it will give you the phone number of your local rescue group, which is, and most of our groups operate 24/7. So we're all volunteers, but our rescue lines are never unmanned and they're never switched off. So give us a call. And then last but not least, I have to do the plug, become a wildlife carer. So consider joining Sydney Wildlife. If you feel like that you're not in a position maybe to do the rescue or the caring, we have all sorts of things that you can do for us. You might want to join rebuild weekends. You might want to come to Warrachar Park or Kakundi, chop fruit for us. You could man our after hours service, our rescue line service, and coordinate rescues for us. You could go into our office and do day shifts. We do a 9 to 1 and a 1 to 5 shift in the rescue office. You meet lots of like-minded people. We give you all the training. We make yummy morning teas. And so that's another way you could get involved as well. And it's just a great way to meet sort of like-minded people. So I'm going to be quiet now because I've gone over time, and I'm surprised that Kira hasn't wrenched me off yet. And I'm happy to take questions if Kira is happy to keep things open, and I know everyone hasn't left.
Yes, we scheduled everyone until 8:30 anyway to allow for a bit of questions.
Yay!
So,
Okay. Sorry, I sped up towards the end there because I thought I was really gabbling on. So
That's okay. Well, yeah, thank you, Sonja. We'll answer some questions shortly. Rhiannon will sort of ask Sonja as a bit of a conversation. If you have any extra you want to quickly put in the chat, please do. Other than that, after Sonja's answered some questions, we'll put up a final poll if you don't mind filling it out for us. It's just 3 little questions for us in terms of feedback to see how you enjoyed it, if you want to see more of this sort of thing, that kind of thing. And also feel free, as Sonja said, to contact her in regards to what you can do to help. I believe so as well, you can also donate through their website. So please feel free to do that if you feel so inclined. Yeah, so Rhiannon, if you'd like to ask Sonja some questions, that would be great.
Yeah.
do I need to close that presentation? Is that, or
If you want to, it doesn't really affect anything.
doesn't matter?
No,
Okay.
it doesn't really matter.
Okay.
So I'll start with the ones that started at the start, and they're mainly about your involvement with the fires. So Marg asked, is Wires affiliated with the Wildlife Council?
No, not at all.
Okay.
So Wires is licensed exactly the same as us, but and was part of the Wildlife Council. The Wildlife Council's been going, makes me feel old, I'm guessing about 14, 15 years, and Wires left about 7 years ago. Yeah, so no, they're not affiliated with us.
Okay. Mike also asked, why weren't you allowed onto public lands? Did that mean the national parks too, that you couldn't access?
Oh, absolutely, it did. It's something that I find really devastating personally. It's something that has haunted me ever since. Not only were we not allowed in, and I understand at the beginning, the lands were not declared safe, that's fine. But, you know, we were working on private lands and they had been declared safe. Many of the wildlife carers and people we were working with, we all have our bushfire awareness training. So from the RFS, so we technically are qualified to go and do those what we call black walks. And national parks closed their doors right across the state and didn't open them until a couple of months ago. So not only were animals that were injured in the fires likely to have perished, but the rest that survived, and there wouldn't have been many, very much likely starved to death. And it's something that's haunted me, put it that way. Yeah.
Did anyone from national parks do their own surveys that you know of? No.
We did on occasion in the Blue Mountains and at a couple of triage areas on the South Coast. I had individual rangers who heard about us bring us animals. So as individuals, we were contacted, but no, we were not approached by government at any point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Catherine asked something a little bit different, but she said the state government has increased its commercial kangaroo kill quota this year to around 2 million, without even knowing how many were killed in the fires. Does the
Yeah.
Wildlife Council have any influence with the state government to stop this happening?
No, sadly, but we have made comments, and we've, as a council, as 26 groups, we have made our position on that very clear, and we made it loud and clear immediately after the fires that we were absolutely opposed to kangaroo shooting without assessment, and we wanted we asked for a moratorium on that until we have any idea of the numbers of all macropods out there, not just the eastern greys, all of them. We also asked for a moratorium on the aerial use of 1080 because the land was so bare, and that even animals that might have a great tolerance for 1080, so some of our natives do, when you're in a landscape that has absolutely no food, you might find a number of baits, and we had real concerns about the impacts of that as well, and we asked for a moratorium on that. So that's our position, but do we have a lot of influence? It would seem not, no.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Liz asked, did you save any lizards from the fires?
I would have to say, in terms of reptiles, I was going to say 2 hands, but I could probably count on 4 hands how many we got in across all of those triage areas. Having said that, though, I've been back to a number of areas, and I've been back to the triage areas, and I've been back to carers' properties doing rebuilds, and I've been amazed that I have seen diamond pythons, goannas, and I've just thought to myself, where did you guys go? How did you escape? So although I was really disheartened, and and thought, wow, they're all gone, they're not. There are little pockets out there, and hopefully enough in certain areas to start rebuilding populations. So, but immediately after the fires, you tend to not get a lot in. That's normal. But yeah, so we did start seeing them later. So
yeah, well, that's encouraging that you're seeing them now.
Yeah. There's hope. There is some hope out there. I mean, I've seen lyrebirds in these fire grounds, and I was like, wow, you're just a little bundle of feathers that really should have gone poof.
Yeah.
Here you all, and you don't fly that well, and here you are. And I saw sort of groups of them, 6 or 8 of them in billabongs, and I mean, apart from the fact that I was jumped for joy, I have no idea how they survived. And you wonder if there's some sort of bush telegraph that operated ahead of the fire front.
Maybe.
I don't know. Lyrebirds have a lot of calls. Do they know the distress calls of a lot of animals? Do the other animals and the birds know distress calls of other species? And did they? I met an Indigenous lady down way out from Canberra, and she said to me, oh, don't worry too much, darling. She said all the birds moved 2 or 3 days before the fires got here. And I was like, oh, really? So even in Indigenous knowledge, there is some sort of telegraph that obviously the animals have a sense of impending, emergency.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. So we also have a question for the koalas. Where did you source the eucalypt leaves from? Were they donated, or did you have to go and find them yourselves?
Both.
Yeah.
And I think that's still going to be an issue. And we've actually, even in Sydney, been asked to plant some, so, to as a backup, basically. So yeah, that's a really good question, and yeah, that's a real issue, because they, as probably everyone knows, Australia's full of eucalypts, but those naughty little buggers only eat X amount of species. They don't eat the full suite of species, and they can be very temperamental about which species they eat. So that is a real concern, and carers had to drive miles in some instances to get the right sort of produce for them, or the right leaf for them.
Yeah. Did you rescue many arboreal fauna, apart from koalas, especially threatened species?
No.
Okay.
Sadly, no. Yeah, gliders, possums. I mean, we got a handful, but no. I just don't think they could move fast enough. The carriers can get quite a bit of speed up. And I honestly think that the intensity and the ferocity and the speed of those fires was such in a lot of areas that you couldn't outrun them, unfortunately. And so no, I would have to say no.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the honest truth.
Yeah. So moving on from the first half of your presentation, Liz had a question. In your opinion, are we losing so many birds due to the development of multi-storey units and high-rises, or would you say the Indian miners are having a larger impact on them? And how would we attract these minority birds into our area again?
Yeah, I would have to say it's loss of habitat. I don't believe that the Indian miners tend to like urbanized areas. So they're quite happy to cruise into a cafe and, eat all the scraps on the footpath. But you're never going to get a lot of the honey eaters or the sort of less well adapted birds that you do see in little bushland reserves. They're never going to do that. So it's two things. It's loss of habitat, but it's also loss of the complexity of the habitat. Having a lawn with a few natives that we're all familiar with and a few eucalypts is not going to cut it for little birds. It's not going to cut it for, it's the complexity of the habitat as well. So it's loss of habitat, and it's a loss of the complexity of the habitat.
Yeah.
And all of the little niches that all of these little birds actually fit into. And it probably also relates to things we can't see. So when you have a more complex habitat, you probably have a lot more complex insect biodiversity as well. And you have more lerps, and you have more psyllids, and you have a whole suite of stuff that we're probably at our level and our vision, we're not sort of aware of. And when we deplete these areas, or we simplify them, that's when we see a loss of, it's only the birds that can adapt that remain, and we lose all the other species. So it really is a matter of maintaining and enhancing, if you can, those bushland reserves, really.
Yeah, which is something that Bushcare tries to achieve.
Exactly.
So if you want to help, you can join the Bushcare program. Another excellent thing you can do is create a habitat garden in your own backyard or a balcony.
And even as you're doing Bushcare, if you're already a Bushcare volunteer, when you stop for morning tea, just spend 5 minutes jotting down the species that you've seen and the date, or put it on your Bushcare report. I'm sure I know in my area.
Yeah, we have a section for that, yeah.
Yeah, but jot them down and make it like kind of a fun thing to do as part of morning tea. Like, oh, we need to, did anyone see anything this morning? And make sure you record it. Oh, I saw a water dragon, or oh, I saw a long-necked turtle down by the creek line, and record them, because and make sure that they go into your Bushcare officers who get them up into Bionet. So you've got records of where these animals are still hanging on.
Yeah. So I've got a few more that have popped up into the chat. So let me just move this over so I can read them. So Liz asked a question. I might be able to help answer this one too. She said, as an ecologist, what is your involvement if there is a chemical spill and there are threatened species in the vicinity? Who would we contact in the above scenario, Wires or Sydney Wildlife? So if there was a chemical spill, you would be contacting council and the EPA. And then we would, if there was injured wildlife, we would also be contacting, Wires or Sydney Wildlife.
Also be contacting Taronga, and simply because depending on what the chemical is or the substance or whatever it is well, EPA and council, because there are human safety concerns. So
yes.
What sort of PPE do we as volunteers need to be wearing, or do we need it made safe before we can then go and get the animals out? And then we need the experts like Taronga, with oil spills and what have you. Taronga will often be the lead agency in terms of wildlife. But depending on what the chemical is, we need some of the experts to tell us how to get that off and how to deal.
So your first protocol would be council, and we would go from there. So question from Marg. I don't know if you want to answer this one, but why did Wires leave the Wildlife Council?
I don't know, to be honest. And if I did answer, I'd be guessing. They are very well. They're not voluntary like us. I mean, all the wildlife rescue and rehabilitation is done by volunteers, and we all work together from that point of view. But they are structured very differently to us. They're run like a business. They have between 40 and 50 staff. So it's a very different business model to how we run. I don't know if that has any impact on it. But one day, hopefully they may join. I really don't know the answer to that. That's a question for them.
Yes, directed questions to Wires. Do you guys have any basic certificate requirements to join Sydney Wildlife?
No, not to join, but we will put you through our training, and that is a requirement. And we have a basic training course, which we're desperately trying to also get online at the moment, because it looks like maybe we'll just be able to start introducing face-to-face, but it's just into developing online resources, which is probably a good thing as well. And that will give you the ability to do sort of adult possums and adult mammals, all your lizards, but not venomous snakes, not grey-headed flying foxes, and not baby marsupials. So you can rescue the adult marsupials, but not the babies. And then we have specialist training that you can do on top of that. And we find that some people love birds. So they really don't care about those snakes, and they don't care about those flying foxes, and the possums are cute, but no, not really. But I really like those birds. And they'll do all the bird training. Me, I will rescue anything, but I don't get birds. I don't know why. I mean, I like them, but I'll rescue them, and then I get them to a carer who knows what they're doing. I do furry things and I do scaly things. So I'll rescue any snake and any lizard, and I'll look after them, and I'll do anything with fur, but And so we find that, and it works really well actually. It's sort of, so you can do specialist training after that.
Okay.
Is there, sorry to jump in quickly, is there sort of rescue and caring jobs that people can do that live in sort of higher density housings that don't have big backyards that, are people able to still help you?
Absolutely. If you wanted to raise baby birds or raise a pair of ringtail possums, you can be mum in a unit. You don't need a backyard. All they need is a pouch,
Awesome.
little pouch, and they'll grow a little bit. But while they're on milk and all of that sort of thing, you do need the ability to take them with you. So you need to either be working at home, or you need a quiet place at work maybe where they'll let you feed them. And then we actually, for weaning and aviary stage, we actually do encourage that separation. So we would, you know, you can do the aviary stage yourself, but it would be better to have that break from you as mum and to give them to another carer for aviary stage. So yeah, you can do all sorts of things, or even in a unit you could, if you had a little balcony, we get lots of birds that run into windows. So there might be a big bird, but they're only concussed. They're only with you for 3, 4, 5 days. A vet check just to make sure they're okay. And all our vets work for us for free. Then into a cage it goes with you. Slowly over a few days, you get it through the terrible headache or the bleeding beak, or, you know, and what have you. You make sure it's feeding and it's sleeping and it's had some rest, and then you take it back and let it go. So there's all sorts of scenarios. That lizards, you only need a tank, you know, like a fish tank to care for them, and you don't need a yard for that. So yeah, there's all sorts of animals that you could help. Yeah.
Okay. Well, following on from that, I've got another question here. If you were interested in being a carer, but you already had pets, for example, Lisa said she, example is a guinea pig, would you still be able to assist in caring the animals, native animals?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We do ask you to absolutely be really vigilant about your hygiene between your domestic animals, whether they be cats, dogs, whatever they are, birds. Some people have pet lorikeets, and that's fine. But because of beak and feather and disease transmission and what have you, we just ask you to keep everything quite separate. So cages you use for your wildlife are purely for wildlife. Cages you might use to home or to transport your domestic animals, that's all you use. And you yourself going between your animals, we're all getting into that habit anyway now. So it's, you know, sterilize your hands with an antibacterial solution, and do the same with all feeding sort of equipment and what have you. But yeah, it's totally possible to do. Yeah.
Okay. And following on from your mention of a beak and feather disease, Jenny, we'll make this the last question. Jenny asked, what is being done to eradicate beak and feather disease in parrots, if you know?
I have heard, and I don't know the success of it, but I have heard that there are now, and I don't know if it's a trial or not, vaccines for beak and feather. It is a real concern. Unfortunately, if an animal's infected with beak and feather, under our license, we're required to put it down. We ask our carers to be really vigilant. It has, in the last few years, jumped species. So it used to be called parrot or P. cytosine, whatever it was. And now they've dropped that because we've now seen it in kookaburras, we've seen it in other species. So that particular virus will readily live in hollows, and parrots use hollows, but then the kookaburra comes and uses the hollow, and we have seen a bit of species jumping. So I like to think that there will be, but really, whoever asked that question, you're right. Beak and feather's been around for as long as I've been wildlife caring, 35 years. So nothing really progressed. There was one vet who did a lot of study on it, Dr. Ross Perry, but he's in retirement now, but he's still around and still active. He doesn't live in Sydney anymore, but I would like to think that there is someone working on that now. And I did think that there was someone looking at trying to develop a vaccine.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to say a few comments before I hand over to Kira to kind of wrap up. There was the mention of the pest animal species. So if you do spot like foxes, rabbits, feral cats, that sort of thing, the best way to report that is a website or an app called Feral Scan.
Yes.
And yes, so we definitely promote that because that's great no matter where you're located. All councils have access to that data, and we do cross-council, like multi-council programs in targeting those species. So that's the best way to get that information to all of us so we can put together an appropriate program and treating those pest species. There was also, how to do some positive impacts. Sonja mentioned composting, native beehives, worm farm workshops. Now, Bushcare isn't involved in that, but we do have a sustainability team at council that does run those programs. So we'll send an email at the end with some of the information that Sonja's mentioned, some contact details, the Bionet data that she's collated, because I know a few of you are interested in that. And if any of you want to join the mailing lists for the sustainability mailing list, and that's where they advertise all their upcoming programs, you just let us know and we'll forward your contact details onto that group and you'll join the mailing list there. So that's all I had to say. And also thank you, Sonja, for an amazing presentation. But now I'll pass over to Kira.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Yeah, so just a big thank you again to Sonja for presenting tonight. We have got this recorded, so we'll figure out a way to share it. It'll be quite a big file, so we're going to work on that. But as Rhiannon said, we'll send out a follow-up email with more details and everything like that. But yeah, thanks again, Sonja.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
No worries. All right, excellent. Good night, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sonja. Bye.
Welcome.